Kenya's total public debt has reached a record 11.36 trillion mark on the back of increased borrowing from the domestic market amid a cash crunch that pushed the state to expensive borrowing. Well, this appended the pledge from the Kenya Kwanza administration to curb expensive borrowing in favor of cheaper sources like the World Bank to reduce debt servicing pressures. And Ms. Brian George explains.
Statistics Sweden.
The latest Treasury data showed that the total public debt outstanding rose from 10.4 trillion shillings in March last year as the government borrowed nearly a trillion shillings from local banks, insurance firms and pension schemes. The cost of borrowing from bonds topped 18.4% last year, while Treasury bills neared 17%, a boom to high net worth investors, but a pain to a government that sought a lower rate. The public debt first crossed the mark in December 2023 when it touched 11.14 trillion shillings in the aftermath of the weakening of the shilling against global currencies like the dollar. It dropped to 10.3 trillion shillings in March 2024, largely on account of strengthening of the shilling against the dollar, which reduced the stock of foreign debt by 920 billion shillings. Domestic debt has, however, grown the fastest in the past year by 17%, or an additional 890 billion shillings to touch 612 trillion shillings from 5.3 trillion shillings a year ago. Public debt grew 9.3% from 10.39 trillion shillings in March 2024 when the shilling strengthened against the dollar. External debt has only grown by a mild 1.3%, rising to 5.3 trillion shillings from 5.1 trillion shillings. Debt owed to commercial banks from local auctions of bonds and treasury bills rose the fastest by 18.7% to 2.6 trillion shillings in March this year from 2.19 trillion shillings in March 2024. Suffice to mention that while the number bulges, the country has opted for strategies to manage it, with the Treasury recently closing in on the country's maiden debt for food swap. The numbers are, however, not clear.
No, we still are looking at the numbers. There are proposals. The proposals are there on the table. Let's not rush into numbers. I think what we need to start to continue discussing are the alternatives and the strategies. Okay. So the strategies that swap. Okay. One of the strategies of managing debt. Let's see how much. There are so many proposals, by the way, which would run into hundreds of millions of US dollars. So we are looking at them.
The decline in domestic interest rates has allowed the government to borrow more as investors race to buy bonds and bills to lock in relatively high yields as they anticipate further falls. The increased domestic borrowing risks the prospects of the state crowding out the private sector at a time when banks' lending is below the ideal rate needed to spur economic growth. Brian George, NTV, Nairobi.